Good morning, Loft family. I am so glad that you're here today on this beautiful morning of worship. We are wrapping up our series, our Lenten series called Missed Opportunities. So every year, Forbes magazine releases the list of the world's most powerful people. And it's based on a number of factors, wealth certainly being one of the main factors, but also spheres of influence and how much influence people have in those spheres. Now, even this early in 2022, I suspect that there will be some major changes to the list from 2021, but the world's most powerful people in the list of 2021 are Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, and Jeff Bezos. So I think if you ask my husband, he would tell you that I'm personally responsible for the wealth and power of Jeff Bezos based on the sheer number of Amazon boxes that arrive at our house. But Bezos aside, the top 4 people have one thing in common: politics. Because power and politics go hand in hand. Now, I'm just gonna admit that I get a little nervous saying the P word up here, politics. So let me just reassure you that today's sermon is not about today's politics. It's not about unity in government or separation of church and state or checks and balances of power, because none of those things even existed in the time period that we're talking about today. Because we're talking about the power and politics of the Roman Empire and the Jewish elite in the arrest and trial of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. So philosopher Plato says that the measure of a man is what he does with power. So we're going to talk about a man today who stood in the presence of the Son of God, who recognized that there was something different about this man. Yet he didn't do the right thing. He missed his opportunity to follow Jesus. Instead, he chose power and reputation and status over Jesus. And today we're going to talk about Pontius Pilate. So Pilate was a powerful man who was appointed by the Emperor Tiberius to the office of prefect of the region of Judea. So he was appointed about 4 years before Jesus' ministry. He served for about 11 years, and 4 of those were after the death of Jesus, until he was ultimately removed for his mishandling of the Samaritans. Now, as prefect, Pilate held all power in the province. He was the IRS, the Supreme Court, and the governor. And he held a type of power that's called the power of imperium, which meant that he was the supreme power of the military and also for judicial. So Pilate alone held the power to execute those who were perceived as a threat to Rome. And Pilate, he is found in a lot of historical writings. He's found in the writings of Jewish historians Philo and Josephus, and he's described as a man of inflexible, stubborn, and cruel disposition. His administration was marked by venality and violence, thefts, abusive behavior, frequent execution of untried prisoners, and endless savage ferocity. And all of the Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all tell us about Pilate. And they all talk about this complex relationship between the Roman government and the Jewish elite authorities. You see, although the local Jerusalem court for the Jews, which was called the Sanhedrin, it was relatively independent. The high priest of the Sanhedrin was appointed by the prefect of Rome. So the high priest Caiaphas, who interrogates Jesus and ultimately sends him to Pilate, well, he was appointed by the Roman prefect who preceded Pilate. So it's safe to say that the Jewish elite were part of the politics and power structure of the Judea province. Now, the Jewish elite, they were allies to the Roman government, And they mainly functioned to maintain order and control in the province and to keep the tax revenue floating to the Romans. And if any reason there was disorder or an uprising, then Roman government would step in and swiftly punish. And you can see this dynamic in the book of John. It happens right after Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Many people believed in Jesus, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." So from that day on, they planned to put him to death. So the Jewish authorities, they acknowledged the threat that Rome poses to them, but they also acknowledge the power that they hold. So what we're going to see in this, we're going to see the power and politics of both the Roman government and the Jewish elite in the events of the trial of Jesus Christ. And so before we can understand the trial, we must understand the crime. And a great place to start to understand that is at the arrest of Jesus. It happens in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it tells us that after Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with the police from chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So when Judas arrives at the garden, he brings with him a cohort of Roman troops, and he brings with him the police from the chief priest and the Pharisees, the religious cops. And so the presence of both Roman troops and the religious cops shows us that there is a mutual collaboration in the arrest of Jesus. Why? Because Jesus will be charged as a threat to both religious and political power. So after Jesus is arrested, he stands two trials, one with the Jewish authorities and one with the Roman authorities. First, he's taken to a secret, somewhat shoddy, quick Jewish trial that violated the laws and standards they had in place for trials. So they take Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes were assembled. And now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many gave false testimony against him, and their testimony did not agree. And this is a real problem for people who are looking to put Jesus to death because they have to charge him with a crime. And testimony from witnesses, they need at least two people whose testimony agrees. So more people stood up and gave false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' But even on this point, their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Have you no answer? What is it they testify against you?' But he was silent and he did not answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' And Jesus said, 'I am. You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven.' Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, 'Why do we still need witnesses? You've heard this blasphemy. What is your decision?' And all of them condemned him as deserving death." So they have their conviction of a religious crime, and they take Jesus to Pilate, because Pilate is the only one who holds the authority to execute Jesus. So if they want to remove Jesus as a religious threat, well, they're at the mercy of Roman power. And in terms of the Roman trial, we can't really think about it in the same way that we would understand our modern day trials, because the terms like justice and law, it's different. Jesus's welfare would not have been a priority or a concern for Pilate. Justice and law, those were actually tools for maintaining control and preserving power and ensuring that tax revenue continued to the ruling elite. So Pilate's primary concern would have been, is this person a threat to Rome? Is he a threat to the status quo? Jesus' guilt and innocence, in the way that we think about trials today, that would not have been a concern. And Matthew Skinner, a biblical scholar, he says the foundational question beneath a governor's ruling in criminal cases then was not necessarily, has this person broken a law, although it can be a secondary question. The inquiry is more along the lines of, has this person done anything that endangers the social welfare or threatens Roman values? So when they take Jesus to Pilate, it says they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. And it was early in the morning. And they themselves didn't enter into the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out and said to them, what accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered, if this man were not a criminal, we would not handed him over to you. And Pilate said to them, take him yourself and judge him according to your law. And the Jews replied, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. And this gives you insight into the taunting power of Pilate, because he knew that the Jews didn't hold power to execute. But he wasn't missing an opportunity to remind them about how much they needed him. So Jesus stands before the governor, and the governor asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus said, you say so. But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. So then Pilate said to him, do you not hear how many accusations they make against you? But he gave him no answer, not even a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. So Pilate tells the Jews, I find no case against him. And then Pilate comes up with a reasonable solution for the Jews. He says, but you have a custom that I release someone for you at Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? And they shouted in reply, not this man, but Barabbas. Barabbas was a bandit. So Pilate went out again and said to them, look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him. So when Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said, here is the man. And when the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, take him yourself and crucify him. I find no case against him. And the Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to the law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. And he entered into his headquarters again, and he asked Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you? And Jesus answered him, you would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. So John tells us that Pilate was afraid. So what would a powerful Roman governor possibly have to be afraid of? Well, if we pull together the accounts from all the Gospels, it gives us a better picture of the story. So Mark tells us that Pilate executed Jesus out of a wish to please the crowd. Matthew tells us that Pilate was faced with civil disorder. But John tells us what pushes Pilate over the edge. He says, from then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. You see, Pilate realizes that he is in a risky situation. Because if Rome hears that he frees someone that has potentially made a threat to the throne, Pilate risks instability in the province, loss of status and favor with the emperor, and potentially the loss of his appointment as governor. So when Jesus stands before Pilate and Pilate has to make a decision, Pilate thinks regardless of what he believes about Jesus, the risk to himself, it's too great. Pilate's need for power and reputation and status led him to hand Jesus over to die. Because Pilate's desire for power, it far outweighed his desire to do the right thing. And psychologists say that the need and desire for power is an unconscious motivation in all of us. Tim Keller would say that the need for power is one of the 4 root idols that drives our behavior. And I hear that and I think, I'm not a Roman governor. I'm not a president. I will never be a local official. I will never hold any sort of political power, so I don't see how this would apply to me. But you would be surprised at the way that the need for power shows up in our lives. So I'm going to read to you a list and a description from Psychologists Today that describes to us the way that need for power shows up in our lives. And I just want to say up front that I copied and pasted this over, okay? If this stings, if it hurts at all, you can't blame me. You got to blame science, okay? So here we go. Psychologists define the need for power as the desire to control or influence others. So it can show up in a way that we want people to comply with what we want. It can show up in a way when we want people to do things our way. It can show up in the way that we want people to see us as important. And buckle your seatbelts for this one, everyone, because experts agree that the need for power can be expressed by needing to provide unsolicited advice and opinions. Some behaviors that have been found to characterize those high in a need of power include a high level of physical fights or verbal arguments. Enjoyment of debate is the characteristic of someone who has a high need for power. They express their power motivation in this way, and they may be really uncomfortable with being seen as weak. People with a high need of power can sometimes be seen as chronically hostile. And those with a high need for power enjoy running organizations, being decision makers, and making all the social plans for your friend group. They're probably not going to be the people in your circles who are super easygoing and unopinionated. Another way that the need for power can show up is in the need to gain reputation. People display their need for power by wanting their name known, wanting to make sure they get credit for all their work, that they get credit for ideas, that the more people that know them, the better they feel about themselves. Another way of building reputation is to have possessions that are valued by other people in a group. And these prestige possessions may be clothing, it may be music, maybe any item that you purchase to impress someone or a group. And listen, the number of times that I recognized myself in that list as I was writing this sermon, I was like, I got to get to therapy stat when this one is over. I got a lot of processing to do. But the need for power in our lives, it can have real consequences. From fractured relationships to serious cases of abuse of power. There is a headline every day in the news about cases of abuse of power. It spans every industry, every sector, and the church is certainly not exempt from that. And if we allow our need for power or for reputation to drive our actions and our motivations and our decision-making and our behaviors, then it will affect our relationship with God. It will hinder our ability to follow Jesus. Because if it is left unchecked, we can easily love power and status and reputation more than we love God. You see, Pilate and Jesus, these two powerful men, they stand across from each other, and Pilate, he believes he has the upper hand in this relationship. He believes that he is the most powerful person, and he threatens Jesus with his power. Pilate says to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you?" And Jesus does not let this go unanswered. He says, you would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. You see, Jesus understood something that clearly Pilate did not. It's that all authority comes from God. And any power that Pilate had, well, it had been given to him from God. And it's an understanding that should shape us. It should shape the way we live, especially if we find ourselves in positions of power. Because positions of power, it's what makes our world turn. It's the hierarchy that we live in. It's the structure of our world. And I would imagine that many of you are in positions of power, whether as a volunteer or in your career. Many of you have people who report to you at work. Many of you make decisions that affects the livelihood of people. Many of you hold leadership positions on a serve team or in a small group or in a volunteer organization or your own committee. And I think sometimes we like to soften our identity with power by using language like positions of influence and positions of authority, positions of leadership. Because the word power has been so corrupted and abused that it's almost impossible to believe that power can be positive. But these words, leadership, authority, influence, those are all beneficial forms of power that can be used for good if we rightly steward any power that we have been entrusted with. Because we all have a decision how to use the power that God has given us. And Pilate decides to use his authority to maintain the status quo for himself and to maintain his power. He decides to use his power in his own self-interest. He decides that he is going to wash his hands of this whole situation. He decides to wash his hands of this whole situation. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself. Pilate knew that he was condemning an innocent man. And he tried to use water to cleanse his conscience. The washing of his hands, it was a refusal of responsibility. Pilate washing his hands, it was an act of selfishness. It was an act of self-preservation. There's a Brazilian philosopher who says that washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. Pilate's fear of losing power, it led him to wash his hands. He used his power. He chose to absolve himself from doing the right thing. But Jesus uses his power in an entirely different way. Instead of washing his hands, Jesus used his power to wash feet. It tells us that it was before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. And having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal. He took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So Jesus leaves his expected place of honor and in the center of attention, and he reaches for the last item in the room that the disciples would ever expect for him to grab. Because you see, washing feet, it is an act of subjugation. It is an act that is relegated to household slaves. But Jesus, he took the water and he took the towel and he kneeled before the disciples. And one by one, he used the water to wash the disciples' feet. Jesus, Lord, Son of God, He's on his knees in the posture of a servant, out of humility and out of love, the most powerful person to ever walk the earth, in an act of selflessness, in an act of service. And when he gets done, he asks the disciples, "Do you understand what I have done?" He says, "Now I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, and you should also wash one another's feet." Pilate, he used his power to serve himself. And Jesus, he used his power to serve us. You want to know the way that we protect ourselves from the dangers of the need for power and status and reputation? The way that we ensure that we steward well whatever power we've been entrusted with? It's a life and a heart and a posture that is willing to serve out of humility and out of love. Because you see, Jesus, he could have used his power to call down angels at any moment. He could have overthrown the Roman governor. He could have ruled in power at any second. But he didn't choose that. Instead, he chose willingly to go to the cross, to be beaten and bruised and flogged and lashed and spit on and humiliated and shamed out of a selfless, sacrificial love for us. And when we understand the depths of that kind of love, of that mercy and that grace that we have received, we can offer people that same selfless love. We can offer people a life that doesn't choose power or status or reputation over following Jesus. We can offer people a life that doesn't wash our hands of the problems and the brokenness and the hurting of the world. We can offer people a life who is willingly serving and washing feet out of humility and love. Let me pray. Father, we only have to look to the cross to see your love and your kindness and your mercy and your grace. God, that you would willingly suffer for us, God, so that we could enter into relationship with you. God, I confess that there are so many ways that the desire for power or status or reputation shows up in my life. God, I ask that you would give us a heart of humility, God, a heart of love. God, we desire to choose you over everything, that following you would be more important to us than anything. Our name, how we're known, our reputation, our status, the amount of power that we have in this world, God, that it would be nothing compared to the love that we have for you. And God, I pray for everyone in this room who is in a position of power. God, that we would take that power, that we would rightly steward it, God, that we would do it in the way that Jesus did, out of a sacrificial, selfless love for people, a love that desires for people to know you, a love that desires for this world to be better and to enter into the hurting and the broken, God, so that we can bring life to people. So God, as we look to the cross, we thank you. We thank you for making a way for us. We thank you for your son, Jesus. And it's his name we pray this morning. Amen.